It's episode 13 of the Keto for Women show. You're listening to the Keto for Women show, and I'm your host and nutritionist, Shawn Miner. This show is designed to empower women to find their own expression of the keto diet to maximize their health and happiness. Now let's get started with today's episode. Hey friends, welcome back to Keto for Women. Thanks again for joining me. As always, we have a really fun episode today talking about the role that ketone production can play in mental health, and specifically with Alzheimer's patients, but even for Alzheimer's prevention, depression, anxiety, these kinds of cognitive issues that I know many of us deal with or know somebody that deals with. So I brought someone on, a colleague of mine, to talk more about the topic, as it is something that she has researched. A few things before we get into this interview. Please keep in mind that the Fat Burning Female Project enrollment is open right now as we speak. So go ahead if you want to get going and be part of the 6-week course that starts next week, actually. If you want to get going and be part of this keto community that we are creating over at the Fat Burning Female Project, head to bit.ly/fatburningfemale and enroll, and we will get started soon. Can't wait to have you. That's all I have as far as announcements go. Let's get on with today's episode. My guest today is Amy Berger. Amy Berger is a USAF veteran, certified nutrition specialist, and nutritional therapy practitioner who specializes in using low carbohydrate nutrition to help people reclaim their vitality through eating delicious foods. She loves showing people that getting and staying well doesn't require starvation, deprivation, or living at the gym. Her motto is "Real people need real food." She blogs at intuitnutrition.com, where she writes about a wide variety of health and nutrition related topics such as insulin, metabolism, weight loss, thyroid function, and more. She is the author of The Alzheimer's Antidote: Using a Low-Carb, High-Fat Diet to Fight Alzheimer's Disease, Memory Loss, and Cognitive Decline. I just want to take a quick second before we get into this awesome interview with Amy to just point out a few things about this particular interview. So we have a conversation. The first part of the conversation, we're talking a lot about her own journey with using low carbohydrate diets, being in and out of ketosis, and what she has kind of learned about that. Now, there's a few points where you may notice we have differing opinions, and I point that out, and we do have conversations around that. So I just want to clarify, though, that the reason why we have differing opinions is because Amy is more of a low carb advocate, whereas I'm more of a ketosis advocate. And those are two different things, like we've talked about in past episodes. And if you don't know my view on the difference between those, please go back and listen to episodes in the past where I discussed that. I even talked about it in last episode, number 12. So that is why we have a differing opinion, and why we talk about the main difference being the level of fat that you would need to have in one's diet in order to obtain both of these. And I think most of us listening are interested, at least, if not already doing a ketogenic diet for the healing purposes that ketone production provides us. And the key point is that we need that ketone production. And in order to do so, you do need to follow a specific diet that does require a high fat content. So when we discuss this moderation of fat, in her end, that ketone production isn't necessarily needed for what she is looking to accomplish with her clients or herself in particular. Whereas in my view, that high fat content is needed, because we have to have that level of fat that will produce ketones, and it is a high fat level. So we do discuss that. I just wanted to point this out before we get going, because I know, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from you guys as listeners saying there's just so much information out there. I can't gauge what to listen to and what not to listen to and what to believe and what not to believe. And this may be one of those times where you can see people that believe two different things having a conversation. And that's okay. That's great. We need that. And that's part of the reason why I did want to air this episode, because not only does she have information about healing our brains and the reason why we do have cognitive impairment so apparent in our society, but also to just show that there are people that view things differently. There are people doing a ketogenic diet and there are people doing just a low carb diet. This also comes into play when she does mention that some women need more carbohydrates. And I completely agree with that. In a low carb environment, absolutely, there are going to be people that do better on a higher range of carbohydrates if they're not producing ketones. And that's something that I'm very passionate about, is carbohydrates are going to be necessary so you have energy if you are not producing ketones as energy. So we have two options there. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a disclaimer on those two subjects in particular, just so that you can see there are differing opinions. And I totally understand that this can be confusing for some, but you can see kind of how I navigate the conversation and find out more about what she believes versus what I believe. And we can have some differences, but at this end of the day, we're really just looking to get women healthy and people healthy in general. So that's really what both of our goals are. And maybe there are different ways to do that, but now you can see that. So I just wanted to bring that to light. I think it's a great conversation. I'm really excited for you all to listen to it. And most importantly, really start thinking if there is someone in your lives, whether that be a loved one, a friend, a family member, someone else's friend or loved one. If there is someone dealing with some form of Alzheimer's, dementia, depression, anxiety, any sort of cognitive decline, really any sort of mental health issue, really start thinking about how ketone production could help them. It may not be something that you're dealing with right now, but prevention is also huge. So we talk about all of that, and I'm excited for y'all to hear it. So let's get started with Amy. Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for joining me on the Keto for Women show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
This is going to be a nice, fun little chat. So we are fellow NTPers, both nutritional therapists, but tell everyone a little bit more about yourself and where you came from, what you do now, how you're living, all that good stuff.
Nutrition is definitely not my first career. I was in the Air Force for a very brief stint. I did 4 years. I've worked in the insurance industry. I've worked for the Department of Defense as a civilian. I came to low carb like a million, maybe other people do, which is I was trying to help myself. You know, when I was younger, I was doing what I thought were all the right things to lose weight and have a shape I was happy with, lots of whole grains, margarine instead of butter, no lard, none of that. And I was fortunate in that, unlike so many other people these days, I didn't have any major health issues. I wasn't dealing with any, medical problems, but I was significantly overweight and especially in relation to how I was eating and the amount of exercise I was doing. And I just spent a very long time in a self-esteem hole, blaming myself, feeling like a failure, thinking it was my fault. I need to eat even less. I need to work out even more. And, it just took me a long time to put the pieces together and realize that something just wasn't adding up. And I stumbled upon the Atkins book, actually, the 1992 version of New Diet Revolution, and it just made sense to me. The way that carbohydrate reduction works just made sense. And I remember being very, very scared to try it because it went against everything I was told and everything I was sure of. But it worked. And over the years, my interest in it and my passion for it has expanded far beyond the weight loss and fat loss issues. When you start to see the other things that this way of eating is good for, weight loss is almost like the least impressive thing it does. They're using it now for they've been using it forever for epilepsy, but now multiple sclerosis. And like I have this book about Alzheimer's, and there's PCOS and gout and heart disease and GERD and like you name it, this way of eating seems to affect it favorably. And that sounds like snake oil. It sounds like, oh, this diet is magical. And it's not quite that far, but it really is quite impressive and fascinating what this diet does and how much it affects throughout the body.
Oh, it so is. And I feel like every day more and more info is coming out for us that really makes sense. And like you said, it just makes sense if you really think about it. But I think that story really hit home with a lot of people, including myself, in this whole, in our past, we were eating less and less and less, working out more and more and more, stop getting results eventually, and we're going by what everyone is telling us to do and how it should work. But you realize that wasn't the case. So I really want to talk about that because I think we need to just get more women on board with kind of what I know you agree with and I agree with, which is, calories in versus calories out really isn't a thing. Working your butt off in the gym really isn't going to do all that much either if you're not healing from a different aspect. So how did you make that change for yourself? What did it look like? And how did you make that mental shift too?
It's been so long, I almost don't remember the transition. But that being said, I'm not super strict all the time, compared to, like, I'm not on a super strict ketogenic diet all the time. I consider myself low carb, and I have my treats now and then and my little dalliances. But in general, I've been eating the lower carb way of eating for over a decade now. Actually, far more than that, actually. And I don't even really remember the mental shift, except that, like I said, I was scared. I mean, I've said on other shows, like, I remember the first time I put heavy cream in my coffee instead of skim milk. And I'm like, am I going to have a heart attack right away, or is it going to take a couple of days? Like, am I going to feel my arteries clogging or what? And I think the proof is in the results. When the results come, you start to get less scared because it's actually working the way Dr. Atkins or whoever says it would, said it would work. And I think over time, when I first started this, I was much younger, not making all that much money now, but my budget was even more dire back then. And I just did it with the best I could, whether that was just whatever was on sale at the local store. I didn't know anything about food quality. All I knew was that I had to keep carbs low so I could eat whatever, cheap meat, cheap beef jerky, no big deal. And to an extent, I still encourage that with clients who are on a budget. You really don't have to go crazy with the food quality and worry about grass-fed and organic and all that. But that being said, over time, as I learned, I started with low carb, but as I learned more from the paleo community, I did get more interested, more concerned with supporting local farms and getting more of the grass-fed and organic and pastured and that kind of stuff. So my interest in just the overall health has really expanded, and my understanding even of the biochemistry involved and the physiology involved in why this diet does what it does in different organs and tissues and systems is constantly growing and deepening. And you probably know that phrase, the more you learn, the less you know. Like, there's so many rabbit holes to go down, and maybe you can relate even as a practitioner. Sometimes I actually start it's like that imposter syndrome. Like, I'm aware of how much there is. I don't know. What right do I have to tell anybody what to eat? There's so much out there to still learn, and so many experts that I couldn't touch with a 10-foot pole,
Yeah, it is true. And there is so much. And like I said, more and more stuff coming out each day. But every time something comes out, we just realize how much more we don't know. And like you said, it's just, there's so much research that still needs to be done that will hopefully be done in the next 10, 20 years. Who knows? But it just makes you feel like, oh my gosh, there's so much more still to come.
Yeah, it's really funny because particularly with regard to like using a ketogenic or very low carb diet with neurological issues, we know it works, at least to some extent, in certain conditions. We don't really understand fully why yet, but we know it works. So it's hard to convince some people to give it a try when you can't show them a graph or a chart with the mechanism. And it's fascinating because, like you said, we keep learning more about this, and it leads to more questions. But at least in my opinion, my view, it seems like the more we learn, the more it just reinforces how beneficial this way of eating is.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And it just works. I mean, we have proof in a lot of actual human beings, which is at least a start. to see people having results and taking some major illnesses and reversing those illnesses is pretty much a huge, I think, step in having the right ingredients to get people to trust it, I guess.
Yeah. And social media is kind of a minefield. There's a lot of negative aspects to it, but one of the best things about it in terms of the health and wellness, community is that people that maybe have some odd cluster of symptoms or they just have weird feelings and they don't really know what's going on. 100 years ago, they would have been on their own. Their doctor might not have heard of any of it. They might not get any help. Now they can just go online and do a search, and all of a sudden there's a support group online for exactly what they have. And it's really beautiful in that way that people can learn from each other, especially because, it's unfortunate, but there's a lot of very well-credentialed medical professionals who just have no idea about any of this. And they either have no idea of it, or if they do know about it, they sort of poo-poo it and they think it's not helpful, and they will actively discourage you from even trying it.
Yes, which makes it that much tougher for people like us, but that's okay because it's going to get better for sure. Okay, so before we talk, I really want to get into all of these mechanisms that and how healing this diet can be. But I want to go back to your story again quickly and just talk about how that transition to keto was for you. I mean, I know you said you were scared about putting cream in your coffee for the first time, but do you remember going through that process of getting into ketosis and how it felt and the good and the bad and all that stuff?
I do. Now it was so long ago, but even now I bounce in and out of ketosis. I don't aim to be in ketosis all the time, but I just bounce in and out by virtue of what I'm eating. Some days I'm lower carb, some days I'm a little bit higher carb. But, even my quote unquote high carb day compared to the average American eater is still on the low carb side. It's not ketogenic low. So the point of me saying that is now when I bounce in and out, I don't have the keto flu. I don't have to get readapted. I'm fat adapted and I'm fat burning the whole time. I might not be quote unquote in ketosis, which is, they're not the same thing. But the very first time I got into ketosis, I do remember because I had that keto flu that we talk about, that it's the transition from going from such a high carbohydrate intake. I mean, I was a cereal addict. I lived on bagels. I lived on bread because it was cheap. I was in college at the time. Everything that's just grain and starch is very cheap. I woke up, it doesn't hit you the first day because the first day that you're very low carb, you're still working through your stored glycogen. Even some people the second day you're still working through it. But sometime in that second or third day, I woke up and I stood up out of bed and I pretty much immediately had to sit back down because I was so dizzy. I've never had a headache like that in my life, pounding like somebody was bowling inside my head, dizzy, nauseous. And at that time, I don't think I read about the low carb flu. I don't think it was as well known then as it is now. I didn't know what it was. I think I just maybe thought I felt awful and I didn't connect it to the diet. So I didn't go to the kitchen and eat, drink a glass of orange juice. I just sort of put up with it. A couple of hours later, I felt better, but that whole day I had a really bad headache, just dizzy. I think by the day after that, it was mostly gone. And then I don't recall having that huge burst of energy that some people talk about, when they first hit ketosis, it's like they're just raring to go with energy. I didn't really have that, but I wasn't energy depleted before then. I was young, I was relatively healthy, except for, being a little bit heavy. So I don't think I had a lot of room to go there, but I do remember that, and it's something I still experience now. It was very easy for me to go a long time between meals, and I wasn't shaky. I wasn't irritable. It was just, all right, I'll eat later. No big deal. And that, for me, I was a very big snacker. I always kind of had a snack in my bag, or I was one of those people that I would finish breakfast and an hour later I was fantasizing about what I would have for lunch.
Oh yeah, me too, for sure. I think that came with the let's eat as few calories as possible because all you do is think about food at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I would seriously, I would get bored in class and I would be making lists in the margins of my notebook of what I might have for dinner that night. I'm not a food addict or anything, but I think my mind was always on food, and with low carb, it really is not, I still enjoy food, of course, and low carb food is delicious, but I'm not, just obsessing about it all day long.
Yeah, I always say that actually when I switched to a ketogenic diet, I, for the first time ever, could eat intuitively and have this kind of sense of food freedom, because for the first time ever, I wasn't hungry all the time, or I wasn't thinking about food all the time. Like, I would go hours and forget to eat, which had never happened to me before. Even, trying to be paleo and all of these other, I've been AIP, I've done it all basically, but I always thought about food all the time. And with keto, all of a sudden I was like, oh, it's 5 o'clock. I haven't eaten since 10.
Yeah, and I will say something. I'll say, and you probably agree, or at least sort of understand where I'm going. You see online a lot, people will say, oh, on keto, I'm never hungry. I'm just never hungry. That's not true. It's not true that if you were never hungry, you would never eat. You'd go 6 months without eating. It's not that you're never hungry. It's that your appetite is normalized. Mm-hmm. So you're not like fighting the urge to eat all day where you're hungry, but you know you shouldn't eat, so you don't, and you have to muster all this willpower. It's more like, rather than false hunger signals coming from unstable blood sugar and unstable insulin all throughout the day, those things are evened out, so you get hungry, but you're not hypoglycemic. Like I said, you're not shaky, irritable. You don't want to kill somebody if you don't get fed in 5 seconds. It's a very calm sort of hunger, and it's I try to describe it like a physiological, genuine need for nourishment and calories, rather than like, I just had a donut an hour ago and now I'm starving. Like, I shouldn't be starving. I just ate a donut. It's more like, wow, I'm really hungry. And when I get hungry on low carb, I usually am hungry for protein and fat. Like, I don't crave a bowl of pasta. If I'm hungry, I'm craving a pork chop and broccoli or something like that.
Yes, it's such a huge difference. And I make that distinction all the time, because if it's not like you're ketoing wrong or low carbing wrong for that matter, if you are still hungry. It's okay to be hungry. It's like you take that edge off to where you need to eat, or you're going to either need to take a nap or get angry at the next person you see. You just go from that to more of like a slight kind of feeling of, oh, I should probably eat now. Like you said, my body needs nourishment now. Kind of, it's just
exactly
a totally different feeling. And yes, it is important to make that distinction, because you are still going to get hungry, and that is a normal physiological response.
Yes. and you will still, every now and then, because of different things that are going on in your body or your emotional environment, yeah, you will still crave sweets every now and then. Like, I don't think that for some people that goes away 100% forever, and I think for some people it doesn't, and you shouldn't feel like there's something wrong with you if, once a week you really want a piece of whatever, and it's a matter up to you whether you give into it. But I don't think anyone should feel like they're not fully adapted or they're actually doing something wrong if they find that they still have a desire for those foods now and then.
Oh yeah, I do all the time. I have a sweet tooth no matter how into ketosis I am. It's just because it's just a treat, and we're allowed to have treats and want them and eat them and completely enjoy them. It's just you are consciously making that decision, because you're not so much like having this gnawing craving. It's just like, that sounds really good, so I'm going to eat that today, and it's fine. And that's really, again, where, and I want to talk about this with you, because it seems like you're in this place now where you can kind of cycle in and out, especially after you've been keto adapted for a while. You can really use your intuition to kind of eat what sounds good and know you're still using fat as fuel. You're still doing the right things for your health and future healing and things like that. So I think that's the really important piece about that diet, the diet too, is just being able to be more lenient with it and more fluid with it, and not strict ketogenic for 10, 20, 30 years.
Right.
So I think we'll talk about that, but I want to continue with your keto transition story. So you did end up making the transition. You ended up feeling okay and getting through it. Did you make, in those first maybe 3-4 months even, did you make any mistakes? Did you have any points where you were like, oh, I should probably do this differently? Was there anything that maybe people now could learn if they're making the transition today?
Back then I didn't make any mistakes, but here's the funny thing. I think it helped me actually when I was brand new to this, that I knew so much less about it than I know now. And that sounds weird, but let me try to explain. When people start to learn a lot about this, it's great, right? It's great to be informed. It's great to understand what's going on, but you almost know too much for your own good, and you start experimenting with, bulletproof coffee and fasting and this and that, and you want to try a million different things when what gets most people, now depending on the situation, depending why they're doing a ketogenic diet, whether it's for weight loss or epilepsy or some different goals require different approaches within the ketogenic umbrella. But it's almost like it was easier for me to do when the only thing I knew was that I needed to keep carbs low. Because at that time, we're talking very late 1990s, there was no particular emphasis on loading up on fat. Bulletproof coffee wasn't a thing. Fat bombs weren't a thing. All I knew was that I could not eat starchy and sugary carbs. So at that point, nobody was worried about gluconeogenesis from too much protein, quote, quote, turning into sugar. Nobody was trying to load everything up with extra butter. People weren't afraid of consuming too many vegetables because of getting out of ketosis. It was more like, I can eat meat, I can eat cheese, I can eat nuts, I can eat dairy, I can eat non-starchy vegetables, even small amounts of berries. And like, that's it, the end. And I feel like this might be an unpopular, thing to say, but I really truly feel it's almost like when people start to get more information, it becomes harder for them to implement the diet because we call it paralysis by analysis, right? They're so overwhelmed with different strategies and different controversies when I just want to say, keep carbs low. Goodbye. See you in 6 weeks. Don't worry about the nuance. People are just, so the point of that is I didn't actually make too many mistakes in the beginning, but even now with what I know, I am one of the people that can tell you from firsthand experience, unfortunately, that there is such a thing as eating too much fat on a low carb diet. I've gained weight while being in ketosis. Like, Sean, I am not allowed to keep mayonnaise in my house anymore. And it's because I don't know how to use a tablespoon of mayonnaise. I know how to use half a jar of mayonnaise, just me and a spoon, and forget it. Like it's just not safe for me to have mayo. And, people can easily overdo the nuts and cheese. And it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with any of these foods. They're totally fine on a low carb or ketogenic diet. The problem is they are extremely fat dense, extremely calorically dense. And even when your insulin levels are low, even when the hormonal setup of your body is right, if you're eating a huge, huge excess of fat or of caloric energy, it still has to go somewhere. So I feel like I've made that mistake of just being afraid of protein and thinking if I was hungry, I could just eat fat because that would tide me over. And I don't know if you found this with yourself or your clients, but for me and some of my clients, fat is not the most satiating or filling macronutrient. It's protein. Protein is what fills us up. And so that's kind of the biggest mistake I see a lot of people making now is cutting down on protein in favor of extra fat.
So do you think then that there is a need for women, since that's who we're talking to today, to count calories or to monitor their fat intake in order to get the results they're looking for?
I don't think they have to count calories. I think what you have to do is keep insulin in mind. You want to eat with insulin in mind. So that means you don't want to be snacking all day. Even if you're eating low carb foods, you don't need to be eating 6-8 times a day, little handfuls of this, handfuls of that. Have like 2 or 3 good size meals that fill you up and keep you filled for, 3, 4, 5 hours till your next meal. I don't think they need to count, but I think you just have to be aware of what you're eating. Is it pure fat? Have you had 6 tablespoons of butter or 1 tablespoon of butter? Maybe if somebody thinks they're doing all the right things and they're still not getting results, it might be useful to weigh and measure their food and track, even just for a week or two. It doesn't have to be forever, but they might think they're eating a 2 tablespoon serving of salad dressing, and it turns out they're eating a 1/4 cup or they're eating, 5 tablespoons. And that really adds up. So I think if you can learn to eyeball things and learn to ballpark things, then you don't have to measure anymore.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think, like you said, protein's the most satiating. I would agree with that. I mean, really what we're looking for is this awesome plate of food that has a normal portion size of protein and fat along with that, with some veggies. And that plate is what is so satisfying. If you're just constantly scooping out mayo from a jar, no, you're probably not going to ever get full. And so that, I think the combination of the protein with the fat is what really, really makes for this place where you can go hours without eating. For instance, like if you're having eggs and bacon in the morning, most people feel really good after that because it's like the perfect blend of fat with protein that then makes it that really satisfying meal that keeps you full for several hours before lunch. So yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make. And I think another thing that we should talk about is because what I see in my practice, and I do have a group course where women go through and make the transition to ketosis, but what I see is that there is still a huge fear of fat. And so when you tell people that having an excess amount of fat does cause weight gain, then we go back to, okay, I'm going to put 1 tablespoon of butter on each plate, and then they're only having 3 tablespoons of fat throughout the day, and they think that that's enough to get into ketosis. So I do think we need to make that distinction because there is a different, it's like we're on opposite ends of the spectrum where the perfect amount is pretty much right in the middle, where you're having a decent amount so you feel satisfied and your food tastes good and you're producing ketones, and we can rid ourselves of that fat fear is what is so important, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people, people differ. Some people can do well on a very, very high fat, moderate protein, low carb. Some people need a little bit more protein. It does vary with the individual. And I think for most people at the beginning, at least when you're transitioning, I don't think you need to worry about too much fat. I think it's okay to like err on the side of high fat at that point because your body's transitioning. And it's if the goal is fat loss, I think that the shift away from, let's say 200, even 300 grams of carbohydrate a day to something like 50 or 40 grams a day is such a shock that even when you're eating a very, very high amount of fat, your body's still going to give up some of its own fat stores just because it's such a big change for your body. But over time, I think some people find that they need to cut back for the active fat loss phase. And when, some people find that when they reach their goal weight, then they can increase the fat a little more so that they don't continue to lose. So it kind of balances out. But no, I mean, I don't mean to make anyone afraid of fat. Like certainly when I say like go easier on fat, I'm not talking about a low fat diet, but I just mean, people don't need to, if you are struggling to lose body fat, there's no point in drinking a 500 calorie cup of coffee. So what you would maybe want to do is, what gets you to switch from being a sugar burner to a fat burner, so to speak, is keeping carbs low. What gets you to burn your body fat as opposed to the fat from your plate is going just a little bit lighter on the fat in the food. Because if you're eating a ton of fat from your food, your body has no reason to use its own fat stores. So technically you're still on a high fat diet, but some of that fat is coming from your body fat.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it makes complete sense. And I just fear that people, women in particular, will take that and maybe potentially not get the benefits of producing ketones because they're not eating enough fat. So I just want to clarify that we're somewhere in the middle. That's the biggest difference that I see is women can do a low carb diet and not get into ketosis because they haven't upped their fat enough. And then it actually does more damage to their body in the process of just from adrenal burnout from being too low carb without producing ketones and having enough fat. So we do want to be somewhere in the middle, which like you said, you can't just do a tablespoon of mayo. You have to do all the mayo. So that's really the biggest distinction is.
It's actually a really good point because I think I need to clarify. Like I agree with you completely. I do get a lot of clients who are on low carb, but they're tired, they're fatigued, they're lethargic, and it's usually a calorie issue. Some of them, I actually do find myself recommending more carbs to some people, especially if they're very, very athletic. Some women really do better with a little bit more carb, almost more of a paleo diet than a low carb or ketogenic. But for some women, you're right. I mean, they remove the carbs from their diet, but they don't increase the fat enough. So they're in this huge caloric deficit, and it's almost like they're starving. Of course they're tired. Of course they're lethargic. So they just need to eat more in general, whether more fat, add more protein, and even more vegetables, just more food total.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm all about the more food because that really does help when you're someone that's been, like you and I have been in our past of caloric deficit for years and years and years, and it did some serious damage. Now we have to kind of reverse that and see if we can
Right.
heal our bodies, and food will do that.
That's a really good point because we should say, like, and you may have seen this with whether it's a food or a supplement. When we're trying to get somebody out of the hole, like somebody is in the process of some sort of health crisis or a disease process that we are trying to help them restore, there's kind of a therapeutic intervention or a therapeutic dose of a food or a vitamin or mineral. Then once things start to get better, you kind of taper down or taper off to what we would call a maintenance dose. So that could even be with the fat. We have to get these women out of the caloric hole. They've been restricting for so long. They've been on diets for so long that they sort of have to overcompensate in the other direction for a couple of months. And then we kind of even things out over time.
Yes, exactly. I think that's really what works is kind of restoring your metabolism a little bit. And it takes more food to do that in many cases. So yeah, I think that's great. Okay. So back to your story. So when did this low carb for yourself turn into this passion to learn more for other people?
Oh, well, like I said, I mean, I've had a couple of different jobs and none of which were all that satisfying. And I kind of realized, hey, wait a minute, maybe I could make a living out of nutrition. Like I really love learning about this. I love teaching other people about it. I'm fascinated by it. I never get bored of reading about it and learning new things. So I went back to school. I mean, my undergraduate degree is in creative writing. I was definitely not a nutritionist from the beginning. I went to grad school in my, I don't know how old I was at that point, early 30s. Yeah, early to mid 30s. Went and got my master's in nutrition. And I get most of my income now from freelance writing within the nutrition and health world. I do see clients, of course, and I wrote my book, but it's very cool that I get to combine the writing and the nutrition. I hope to do more of it. But I was looking for a career that I could not only make a living, but something where I would actually really enjoy doing it. So that's where kind of nutrition came in. And to be honest, the only reason I got the degree was really because there are plenty of people out there with no credentials whatsoever who are brilliant, very knowledgeable, very educated about this stuff. I just knew for me personally, I would feel more confident if I had some sort of credential or some sort of letters after my name. But, I do want to stress that doesn't necessarily mean somebody knows what they're doing. I just know that for me to have confidence as a professional, I wanted some sort of formal education.
Yes, definitely. And your master's thesis was about one particular subject, correct?
It was.
Okay, so tell us about that. Tell us how you got kind of involved in the Alzheimer's work.
Okay, well, my book obviously is called Alzheimer's Antidote, and I have no family history of Alzheimer's, so I really had no personal stake in the subject. But in 2008, I read Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, who some of your listeners may be familiar with him and his writing. It was the first place I ever read about a connection between glucose, insulin, and Alzheimer's, and it was really interesting. But not having a personal stake in this, I was just like, oh, that's cool. Maybe I'll research that sometime down the line, whatever, filed it away. And then it was about 4 years later that I was in school for nutrition and I had to do a thesis. And instead of doing an original experiment, I was going to do a literature review, which is basically like you choose a topic and you do a ginormous research paper on it. You basically do a review of the medical literature on that topic. So I said, I'm going to look back at that Alzheimer's thing. I wonder if there's enough information there for me to write a thesis about it. Because I wanted to pick a topic that hadn't been already written about a million times and something that I would actually enjoy researching enough that I could spend, 6 months a year working on it. And when I started to look at the scientific journals on this subject, I was just blown away by what I found. And it was everywhere. It was all over the place, what they call type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. They also use the phrase brain insulin resistance, all with regard to Alzheimer's disease. So it is known, it is taken for granted, it is taken as fact that this is the problem in Alzheimer's disease, type 3 diabetes. Neurons in affected parts of the brain lose the ability to get energy from glucose. So Alzheimer's disease, at its core, it's a fuel crisis. It's an energy shortage in the brain. And so these neurons basically over time starve and atrophy and die. It was just a thesis. But when I was finished with school, I said to myself, I cannot keep this to myself. I feel like this is really, truly, potentially life-saving information. I can't keep this to myself. So I wrote a little PDF with the help of a friend. We just made a little kind of ebook that people could download from my website. And I was really fortunate that a publishing company found my book and offered me a book deal, which is like unheard of. That never happens. Wow. So that's kind of how that happened. But I'm glad it did, because I really feel like this information needs to get to the loved ones and the caregivers, and nobody's doing that. Like, nobody is translating the scientific literature into plain English so that these people can do something with it.
So then if it's a like the type 3 diabetes type disease, in the same case as type 2 diabetes and even type 1 diabetes, a higher fat, lower carb diet works, correct? And so we can use that as a way to prevent Alzheimer's. Is that the way it works?
That's what seems to be the case. I mean, I like to be very careful with the language. I don't say that it's a slam dunk that, a low carb diet can prevent Alzheimer's or reverse it, but certainly looking at the biochemical pathways at work, there is a rationale and there are mechanisms by which a high-fat, low-carb diet, specifically a ketogenic diet, would improve cognitive function.
So there are studies. Are there any kind of people maybe that you know personally where this has actually worked? Have you seen it in action?
Yes, they have done. There are actual clinical trials where they put people either on a ketogenic diet or they use what's called exogenous ketones, which is almost like a ketone supplement. And they have, found that when they get these people's ketone levels elevated, people with Alzheimer's disease or with its precursor mild cognitive impairment, when their ketone levels are elevated, they do show improved cognition. Now, I have to say, not everybody improves to the same degree, but there is literally nothing else to help these people. This is worth a try. There are 0 pharmaceutical drugs for this condition. I mean, there are drugs that exist. They have no appreciable impact upon disease progression, meaning they don't do anything to retard the progression of this disease. They don't improve it. Maybe they slow it down a teeny tiny bit, and that's the best you can say about them. So besides the clinical trials that have been done specifically looking at ketones, and real quick for anyone listening who's not aware, the reason a ketone elevating diet or other ketone elevating interventions like exogenous ketones, like exercise, like fasting, like a couple of other strategies, the reason this is potentially really helpful for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of cognitive impairment, these cells, for some reason, are still able to metabolize ketones. Ketones are like an alternative fuel source for these cells. And if the main problem is that these cells are starving to death, well, let's give them a fuel they can use. Let's feed them. Let's nourish these neurons. So there's a doctor named Dale Bredesen who is becoming really famous in the Alzheimer's community. He actually has his own book coming out in August called The End of Alzheimer's. And he is really the first person to documentably reverse mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's. He hasn't done it with really severe kind of late stage Alzheimer's, but definitely people that are actually diagnosed and people that really had lost the ability to care for themselves, couldn't work, and they're doing fine now. And his protocol is not even a ketogenic diet. It's more of a Mediterranean diet. So it's slightly higher fat. I think he uses the phrase low glycemic. It's not a ketogenic diet, but it is a multifactorial intervention. There's diet, there's fasting, there's supplements, there's exercise. It's a huge conglomerate of things, but many of the interventions reduce insulin. I feel like that's the big key to all of them, like fasting, exercise, sleep, low-carb diet. What do all those things have in common? They improve insulin sensitivity and glucoregulation.
Right. And really even just with a low-ish carb diet and fasting, that would probably produce ketones as well, just those 2 interventions. So maybe there is ketone production in that protocol too. That's so fascinating. Now, if someone goes to the doctor, just their general care practitioner, is that doctor going to acknowledge this at all with Alzheimer's?
I would hope so, but probably not. Unfortunately, this I want to say that this is in its infancy. I don't think it's in its infancy. I just think it takes a very long time for these findings to trickle down from the laboratories and from the research institutions to the average family physician and even to the average neurologist. I mean, frankly, there's probably a lot of people listening right now who've never heard the phrase type 3 diabetes, even though this is all over the medical literature. Like if
Right.
someone in your family is living with this condition and this is the first time you've heard that this is actually a metabolic problem, and by metabolic problem, I mean it has to do with the way the brain is generating energy. If this is the first time you're hearing that, that's a crime because your neurologist should have been the first one to tell you this.
Yes.
Like I always say, I should not have had to write my book. I wrote my book because no doctor beat me to it.
Mm-hmm.
No neurologist, no geriatric specialist beat me to it. That's a crime. Because this has been known for, at least 15 years.
Yeah, I just have a feeling that information is not being spread as quickly as we need it to because Alzheimer's is becoming more and more prevalent,
Yes.
And if it's something that we could prevent even and start preventing now before it even gets to that point, especially if you're someone that has it in their family or something like that, maybe we could be seeing less of it. But it's just not the case right now.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because nobody develops Alzheimer's disease overnight. Nobody wakes up, oh, I have Alzheimer's, I have dementia. This is a condition that builds for years and years, and in some cases, decades. They can actually measure the decrease in the brain's glucose usage in people as young as their 30s and 40s, people who are at risk for this disease. Except when you're young, your brain is able to compensate, so you don't know this is going on. By the time you start actually manifesting signs and symptoms, by the time you start losing your memory and kind of acting funny, this has already been brewing for years and probably decades. So yeah, I agree with you. I think some degree of carbohydrate reduction, a real food, whole food, paleo type diet, I think is very good for prevention. I don't think a strict ketogenic diet is required for prevention. And I have a chapter on potential prevention in my book. I think that the strategy that's required to reverse this once it's already taken hold is more severe and more strict than the one that would be needed to prevent it from happening in the first place. And I kind of use the example that if you have an ant infestation in your house, an insect infestation, you call an exterminator and they set off a bug bomb and that kills the bugs. That doesn't mean you have to set off a toxic bug bomb in your house to prevent the infestation in the first place. What you could do is keep the windows closed, don't leave food unsealed on the counter. You know what I mean? Like these low-level, very effective interventions will take care of the problem before it is a problem.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Now, if we do know somebody that has already been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and has seen some of the progression happen, it's worth putting them on a ketogenic diet and maybe introducing exogenous ketones as well?
I think so, yes, absolutely. Although, let me real quick just say, there are a number of different forms of dementia. And not all of them have the metabolic signature that I attribute to Alzheimer's, right? There's vascular dementia, there's just other forms of dementia that might not respond as well or respond at all to a ketogenic diet, because if the dementia is caused by some other issue, then it may not be that this intervention is right. And unfortunately, Alzheimer's disease is kind of a differential diagnosis. They don't officially diagnose you until you're dead, and they dissect your brain and they look for those amyloid plaques. It's sad but true. Like they'll kind of guess and tell you that you have Alzheimer's dementia. My point is that if somebody is experiencing these problems and they do think they have this condition, I would also get a pretty good comprehensive blood work done. And one thing that you absolutely must measure is your insulin level, because I keep using this phrase type 3 diabetes, and we're talking about the role of insulin in cognitive function. But if somebody out there listening knows somebody with Alzheimer's, they might be thinking, well, grandpa doesn't have diabetes, or, oh, my wife isn't a diabetic. There's a problem with the way that we diagnose diabetes, or I'm speaking of type 2 specifically.
Right.
We only look at glucose. They will diagnose you as type 2 diabetic based on a fasting blood glucose or your hemoglobin A1C or your response to the oral glucose tolerance test. The problem with all of those is they only look at glucose. Nobody's ever looking at insulin. And it's the chronically high insulin that's probably contributing more to Alzheimer's than the glucose per se. And the fasting insulin, it's very easy. You just have to ask your doctor for it. It's not a difficult test. You just have to specifically request it. I think it should be a standard part of routine blood work. And when it is, it's going to be a game changer because they will see that literally millions upon millions of people have what we call chronic hyperinsulinemia, which just means your insulin level is too high too much of the time. And so many people have normal blood sugar and even a normal A1C because sky-high insulin is keeping those things in check. And I just think if it's worth getting your insulin tested if you are experiencing these kinds of cognitive problems. And there's so many other things attributable to high insulin, whether it's PCOS, gout, erectile dysfunction, hypertension. High blood pressure really has nothing to do with sodium in most people. It's all insulin. And just nobody's looking for it.
Yeah, I totally agree that you're not getting the full picture of your blood sugar health without getting your insulin, and not enough people are getting it or even knowing to ask. And like you said, it can be done. It's just not on the most basic panel that doctors are doing. But if you ask, they should do it for you. And I think that's so important. Even just beyond Alzheimer's, just to know that about yourself is really, really huge and can really be a game changer in your health and healing journey for sure. Can you talk a little bit about the exogenous ketones for anybody that may not know how that works?
Yeah, so the exogenous ketones, like I said, they're kind of like a ketone supplement. And what they can do is, regardless of the type of diet you're following, even if you're eating a lot of carbohydrate, you can get ketones into your body and into your bloodstream by taking these exogenous ketones. And they typically come in a powder and you mix them into a beverage. I haven't actually tried them myself yet. I am told most of them taste awful, but it depends on what the particular formulation is. There's a bunch of different, there's a couple of different formulas out there. I don't recommend using exogenous ketones for things like fat loss or type 2 diabetes or even PCOS or some of these other high insulin conditions, but I do think they can be very helpful for people with dementia or people with a neurological condition, because there's a lot of conditions for which we use low-carb and ketogenic diets where the real bang for the buck and the real efficacy of the diet doesn't come because of the high ketones. It comes because of the low glucose and the low insulin.
Exactly.
It comes from running on fat. The high ketones do not cause weight loss. They're a result of breaking down fat. So I do think, though, that the exogenous ketones can be really helpful in the conditions in which high ketones do have an effect, which Alzheimer's is definitely one of them. Parkinson's is another, ALS might be another. Like some of these neurological and neurodegenerative disorders might really benefit from higher ketones, not only above that, which most people's bodies would naturally produce even on a ketogenic diet, but particularly the people with Alzheimer's disease. Some of them are not going to be capable of sticking to a very strict diet. They're demented. They have personality changes. They have behavioral disturbances. You're not going to, if somebody's young, like if they're relatively young and they have a very mild form and they're aware of what's going on, they can take a more active role in their own care. They can change their diet. They can exercise more. They can do some of these other things. The people that are very old, or even not that old, but very severely impacted with cognitive impairment, it's going to be really difficult to get them to change their diet. And if you can't, then give them these ketones. I believe that the real 1-2 punch, the real effective thing to do is both. Do a ketogenic diet and take the exogenous ketones. Get these people's starving brain cells fueled any way you can. But for the people that you really cannot change their diet, I think these exogenous ketones can be a godsend. But like I said, if you're using a ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet for fat loss or for some other issue, I don't see much benefit. I think you're going to waste your money. I think you're going to the benefit in those cases come from the biochemical state that your body has to be in to produce its own ketones, not to just take ketones in from the outside.
And you still have to work to heal your blood sugar. That's what's going to do the trick for most of those cases. And if you're going to be eating a high carb diet and just putting in exogenous ketones and saying you're in ketosis, you're still not doing that work, which is, eating the lower carbs and eating the higher fat to stabilize your blood sugar, which is what we really, most of us need to do to heal. And so
exactly. If you're going to eat 2 donuts and then drink some ketones, you are not going to get the same physiological benefits as if you were just on a ketogenic diet. But I do want to say, I don't have experience with this myself, but there are physicians who use low carb diets in their practices. And some of them have reported that at least in the short term, to help people transition to the low carb diet from coming off the standard high carb diet, they do use the exogenous ketones because people find it kills their cravings, it gives them more energy, and supposedly it helps take away that keto flu. Like they don't get the headaches, they don't get the dizziness. So I could see if that works, that is a legitimate use for these things, but they wouldn't be forever. Maybe you use them for 2 or 3 weeks until your body has transitioned and then you stop.
Yes, completely agree. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, one last question. This may just be kind of maybe an opinion-based question. How do you feel, because you do have this research in the brain on ketones, how do you feel about it potentially being a helper for other things like depression and anxiety?
I think they can be absolute godsends. I do. And there's case reports in the medical literature for bipolar, for anxiety, for depression. And I think part of that is because it normalizes the blood sugar. I think a lot of mood swings and anxiety is just hypoglycemia. I really do. I think a lot of that is just wild ups and downs on that blood sugar roller coaster. For depression, I think it might have to do more with maybe getting more good fats, good fatty acids that the brain really needs, and even maybe some of the nutrients that are more abundant in the foods that we would expect people are eating on a low carb diet, like the zinc, the iron, the choline that you're going to find, and the B12 especially, the stuff that you're going to find in red meat and egg yolks. Now, that being said, it's not a slam dunk. It's not a sure thing. I myself experienced very, very severe depression, even though I'm on a low carb diet and I bounce in and out of ketosis. Mine was thyroid related. So depending on what the cause of the depression or anxiety or mood swings is, I think this can help. But I think even if this doesn't take somebody all the way, I'd be surprised if they didn't have some kind of noticeable improvement.
Yes, I agree. And just seeing it and seeing a lot of clients that have issues with depression and anxiety, and they are able to at least have some relief from that just by, like you said, it's all about getting those higher fats and all the nutrients that come from those fats and how nourishing they are to our brains. So really working on that helps a ton just with all of this, with everyone. Everyone needs that at some point, right? Well, that was so phenomenal. I just love that information about how we are really seeing this Alzheimer's as kind of something that could be helped and reversed through diet. I think that's becoming more and more popular and more of a subject that people are bringing up. Hopefully doctors will catch on, which would be absolutely amazing. So this is all laid out in your book, obviously probably in super great detail, more so than just in this little bit of time we had. How can people get a hold of that?
Well, the book is called The Alzheimer's Antidote, and they can get it on Amazon. There is a Kindle version. There's no Audible version yet, but there might be one coming. I've had several requests for it. So that's on Amazon. My website is Tuit Nutrition, TUIT nutrition.com. It's kind of going through a transition right now. It's on hold a bit because I'm trying to make a new site, and I don't want to put up any new blog posts until that's done. But I'm also very active on Twitter, so my handle is Tuit Nutrition on Twitter.
Amy, thank you so much for being here. This was really, really fun.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, lady, do you want to make sure that you are doing the ketogenic diet the right way for you? Do you want to make sure you're getting all of those amazing benefits that come with producing ketones and not putting any extra stress on your body? Then head to my website and check out the Fat Burning Female Project. We have a new class starting soon, and I'd love to have you be a part of it. Head to bit.ly/fatburningfemale. That's bit.ly/fatburningfemale. And make sure to sign up to get a notification of when the next class will be. Can't wait to see you there.